Obrigado pela oportunidade. No ano próximo posso falar em português, mas hoje em inglês. Perdão. Huh? Okay, so today I'll speak slowly. Everyone here speaks English or understands if I speak relatively slowly. We're going to be talking about community mediation and specifically what we mean by the difference between conflict resolution and transformation. And first, we're going to talk about a power that we've been talking about AI and technology. And I'm going to propose that there is one power that is more potent than this. It has the ability to bring together millions of people, provide you with superhuman strength, creativity, memory that can last generations. And that power is conflict. It makes us very creative. But there is a problem with conflict because we think the opposite of conflict is peace. And we think of peace like this. What I see in this photo is massive amounts of conflict. How many metric tons of water are carving through stone? While you have roots pushing through the earth, inside that water are animals acting like animals, eating each other ruthlessly. When we see conflict like this, we think this is natural, this is nature. What if I told you it was the same as this? What if this was also part of nature and necessary? And what I see in these photos are what happens when our basic human needs are not met. So in mediation, we have the pleasure of not judging whether something is good or bad. It just is. And when you have that lens, you can see things as they are. One of the challenges we have is how we see conflict. Often we know we're in conflict when we see anger. And we can experience anger, frustration, avoidance. You can feel your heart beating in your chest. And if this is the only way that you see conflict, no wonder we want to resolve it. Another way of saying resolve it is to avoid it. We want to avoid it. We want to get it done as quickly as possible. What if I said you could see something more under anger? What happens when someone is angry? Obviously, sometimes it's an expression of fear. Fear of what? Why are you afraid? Afraid of loss. Loss of my idea of how the world should be, my identity, my perception. And why is any of that important? Because I care. One of the hardest things to see when we're experiencing anger ourselves or in another person is that it's because we care. If you remember nothing else from today, you can remember that when someone is yelling, when someone is raising their voice, two things are true. One, they don't feel listened to. And two, they care. Because in nature, there is no waste. So unless you didn't feel listened to or you didn't care, you wouldn't bother to raise your voice. Now, one of the people, when you're yelling, who's not listening to you, is you. Which is why sometimes just having someone repeat back to you what you said helps to calm you down. Now, what if all of these words could become these words? What if the conflict actually meant that we're in a relationship? Often couples who've been fighting, they've been going through a divorce, it takes them extra long. Why? Because the conflict actually keeps them connected. It becomes an identity that I'm afraid of losing. I don't know who I am without this conflict. Because we have connection. And so because I am not here judging whether conflict is good or bad, I get to see it as all of these words if I choose. So I'll start a little bit about my history. So I began as an architect. I was studying architecture here when this happened. It happened in the afternoon. I remember it very clearly. And what I thought when I saw this was, this is how loudly someone had to speak to feel listened to. Because if they could have done it any quieter, they would have, and maybe they did. Because to want to kill other people is part of evolution. It's part of a human condition, part of most mammals' condition, actually. But to kill yourself for something you believe in is counter-evolutionary, goes against evolution. So you don't kind of believe it, you 1,000% believe it. So to call this person a terrorist or crazy pretends you know something about someone that you know nothing about. And the law would say, well, you incarcerate them or you put them to death. That is a resolution that allows us to avoid the actual conflict. What produced this outcome? And so I found that I could no longer just pursue a career in architecture. So I opened an office, but also when I got back, and I did plenty of work around the world, got to practice in Dubai and India, lots in the United States. But I also opened social benefit company that worked renting living Christmas trees. We're on the show Shark Tank. Mark Cuban is my business partner. And we helped people, adults with disabilities, homeless people, to deliver living Christmas trees that went on living after Christmas. I joined a school board. I began doing mediation work with the juvenile court system. And then finally, I joined Mediators Beyond Borders, a chance to do mediation and travel around the world, which was amazing. And I continue to do that work today. The way we do this work is that we only work when we're invited. Someone asks us, well, what are you doing right now in Yemen? And I say, nothing. We have not been invited into Yemen because we can only work through local partners. You do not want predominantly white people coming in from the outside and telling people how to do things. We only work through our partners because that's what makes it contextualized for them and giving them that global perspective. In all of our teams, we have someone from the local context on the team, but someone outside the local context because we often can't see our own cultures. It takes someone outside of that culture to point out some of the processes. So I reached out to Jay because all of these different backgrounds, I thought maybe this is what we mean by peace engineering. Bringing in architectural design, actual thought processes, conflict resolution, and social entrepreneurship all together. One of my professors, when I was studying in Italy, or actually in Thailand, he said, you know, there's guy Maslow, and he's our hierarchy of needs. I said, okay. But I've lived in communities that didn't have proper food, shelter, and clothing. And they would say that they are self-actualized. But if this community over there threatens to take away their identity, they'll do what? They'll go to war. And when you go to war, you give up food, shelter, clothing, security, community, all for what? Your identity. So when we think of what the roots of conflict are, it oftentimes is about things that are free, honor and dignity. And how do we start with that when we're working in communities? We see the problem, we see the loss, we see the death, but can we see the individual? What is causing this? And take the worst thing you're experiencing. Someone's yelling at you in traffic, in the middle of traffic, and you get to think, what is their unmet need right now? And so this one gentleman said, all conflict comes down to three things: safety, identity, or recognition. And I invite you to think about all of the conflicts in your life, big and small, and I would say that they exist somewhere in here, and the really good ones are right in the middle. Now another gentleman came and said, that's too simple. and divided up in freedom, belonging, protection, and all of these pieces, you've experienced some form of conflict or another in your life. These are our universal needs. Now, how they get expressed changes from community to community. And I would say that forms our values. Our culturally informed way of meeting our needs is how I define values. And those change because we have different cultures who inform how we meet our needs. When all of those meet, this, to me, is what is called positive peace. Anything less than all of us having our universal needs met is not peace. There's some talk right now of there being a peace agreement in the Middle East. It's not peace. It's a ceasefire. We're just not actively killing each other. But this happens in organizations as well. Just because people aren't calling each other names and yelling at each other, we think, oh, this is a peaceful office. No, you're not at peace. You don't have actively meeting your needs. If you're actively meeting your needs, we might be arguing constructively and creating tension by which to work with. So knowing the difference between negative peace, which is we're just not fighting with each other, and the messiness of positive peace. So there's the Institute for Economics and Peace, which actually put metrics on top of this and said, if you have all of these pieces and they measure it, then you have a peaceful society, which is just another way to say all of our universal needs are met. And why we work in communities, so Mediators Beyond Borders, we often get confused with doing international mediation with track one heads of state. And what we say is, well, if you showed up to the negotiation in your BMW or your private plane, there's a pretty good chance you're not going to be impacted by whatever you put your name on. So we choose to work with those who are impacted, the people in those communities. And how do we resource them to advocate for themselves, to be at those peace tables, to be part of negotiations, be part of that design that Brian was talking about. And so we've dedicated ourselves to working in community. And what you're looking at in these pictures are the community projects that came as a result of 4 years of training in South Africa, where we have 100 community mediators who then got to work in their own communities with the skills that we help them provide. Also get to do projects like working with the Ugandan police force and training them in community mediation. What's unique about them is they work in the communities where they have to arrest people. So they have a vested interest in the people coming out of prison, moving back into their communities, having actually grown from the process. And so training them in community mediation beyond just right and wrong, what does the law say? What the law says is not going to help that person get better. And so understanding the role of trauma in both in themselves and the communities they serve. So Brian mentioned working with Indigenous communities, and I got to do the same. I've worked with communities during COVID, and I thought, what do I have to teach any Indigenous community about dialogue? Except when COVID happened, they had to meet online. They don't have any experience meeting online. How do you build community in a virtual space? And so I got to work with the elders, and I would share my training with them, and then they would teach me what it means in their context. And so I was talking to one of the elders, and she said, Martin, what you're talking about is not a suggestion. It's a Niska law. And this law says, and I'll read it for you, Dim hulen kelm guden silgaden, which means to be careful not to hurt the heart of others. And be careful to listen with a compassionate heart. Again, sounds like good advice, but why is it a law? Well, you're talking about a community that doesn't write things down. They have an oral tradition. Scientifically, what happens to your brain when you feel challenged, when you feel threatened, when you threaten someone else? The part of your brain that remembers positive memories shuts down. Why is that important? Because without the positive stories about each other, the fabric of our society goes away. Now I just said our, because this no longer just applies to indigenous communities, it applies to all of us. Someone could have dedicated 20, 30 years of their life to public service, but if they are a different political persuasion than us, we can't name one thing positive that they've done, because we've been conditioned to only remember the threats in our environment. It's a good opportunity to breathe. Because when conflict happens and occurs to us, it feels a lot like this. This is what happens to our brain. We were going along the path, and the path got interrupted. All I can think about is now how something's in my path. I'm unable to think about different ways of getting around it. And this is what it feels like. And so when an outside person who is not affected by this, a mediator, I can help transform how they view this conflict. Because when I'm affected by it, especially when I have complex trauma, this is what I'm experiencing. Now, we'll talk a lot of people dying around the world because of conflict or environmental crises. And in the country that I come from, I say that I'm from the Republic of California, but the Republic of California is part of a larger country. And they talk a lot about building walls. And the numbers actually are quite low in the United States of how many people are killed by illegal foreign nationals. However, we do have on average 17,000 homicides. So that makes you think, well, we put a wall around our community, then we will be safe. Except that most of the people, the victim knew the perpetrator. So you say, well, I'll put a wall around my house, then I will be safe. Except most of them you were related to. So then you think, maybe I'll be successful if I lock myself in my room. Then I will be safe. Except that year, 44,000 Americans committed suicide and took their own life. And when you add drinking, smoking, drugs, and obesity, you are 80 times more likely to kill yourself than to be killed by another person. But what are we taught? To be afraid of others. And I get to pick on Americans because I happen to live in that country, but worldwide, almost 1 million people take their lives, which is more than war, homicide, and terrorism combined. So think about how much money we spend on all of these three things. National disasters doesn't come close either. And how much time we spend speaking about all of those things when the answer is actually in the room. Technology has been helpful, but it's also allowed fewer people to be in this room. And so our ability to come together, to connect with one another, is actually the most important peace-building tool that we have. And to not just look at conflict as something that needs to be resolved, but as an opportunity to bring us closer together. Thank you.
It's an awesome presentation as the last presentation of the day because it really gives us a revival moment. I don't think, comments. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It was great to hear you. I like go sailing blue water, and you gave me a lot of facts and data to support when people say that's dangerous, right? About the organization that you are part of, is there any case in Brazil specifically that you would like to share with us, and how we assess these use cases and see how we can be part of it somehow.
Thank you. So we did just recently have a process in southern Brazil around the flooding that occurred. And what we did is created a training on trauma-informed peace building and mediation. And so we trained a lot of community mediators in trauma on how to work with those communities who've been affected, so that before going to politicians and effectively we're able to come to town halls together, be able to express themselves, understand the trauma that's occurred in order to be able to express themselves more fully. So that's a project. I think it was just temporary for that time, but certainly interested in expanding as opportunities come up. Yeah, I think that was correct.
Hello, I really like your presentation. I would like to know how engineers could help to reach the peace for you.
Yeah, so I think what I've been listening to and hearing is all of us bring a different perspective, and a systems approach, an engineering systems approach to peace building is dynamic. So the more ways we can look at this, and we were talking about using technology and running simulations on what are the possible outcomes and what are the possible solutions. And as Brian was saying, the use of AI, both from a technology standpoint, but also an empathy standpoint. I've been working with a case where I've got two severely impacted people from trauma. And so the law is not going to help them. If they went to court, it would get tossed out of the court because their ability to advocate for themselves is low. And so how do I navigate this as a mediator, keep within the law and support people affected by trauma? And so I can run simulations with AI of different approaches and what different responses I might receive from someone who is experiencing trauma. And so being able to use these data sets and be able to come up with options for mediators would be a very helpful way of using technology, for example. But then using that in a broader sense for a systemic approach would be really helpful.
I can see how this mediation process works with people and intra-organization, but I'm curious in how this works inter-organizations. So think in companies, and the conflicts between companies is interesting for like Tesla to be with peace with Volkswagen or BYD. How this conflict works, and can a mediator helps to improve the market or anything like this?
So let me help me understand. So what's an example of a conflict between organizations?
So when they are, I have an example of Coca-Cola and Pepsi when they were fighting for market share, and it's sometimes not a constructive thing. Like it's like one beast eating other. So do you have any case of this happening, or in the case of a mediator acting between two companies?
Yeah. So one thing to be aware of in a community-based approach is to not get fooled into thinking that any conflict is between two people or two entities. All conflict happens in an environment. And so people having a business dispute that's financial may not have an issue, but you probably have stakeholders involved. And so being able to bring stakeholders into the environment and being able to bring, you'd have to map who all is impacted by this. And we like to think, because it's very comforting, that it's just two entities. But who are those entities? Who is Coca-Cola? Who is Pepsi? And so being able to unpack that, like even the question of like, well, how do you negotiate with Hamas? They're not trustworthy. Who is Hamas? Is Hamas a person? Or is it a movement? Or is it an ideology? And so we like to group people into thinking, because that's how our brain likes to work, is in these silos. What community mediation invites you to do is look at a larger picture and say, no, that feels very safe to think that, but it's actually quite dangerous. And so to be able to pull it apart and what are the parts involved, and making sure all of them are at the table, because those ones that are not at the table could be the spoiler that upsets the peace process. Is that helpful?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Correct.
So this is where we are right now. You touched Gaza or Ukraine.
Yeah.
A lot has been destroyed, and all the actors are many and changing. So how do you resolve this? And it's going to be, and then you have to think of technology. Okay, so we need to provide water to Gaza citizens, right? Just water. Think of, we need to pump water. That's basic thing. To move water, we need what?
Power.
Supply of water, and we need to move that. What do we need? Pipes, right? Make the pipes metal. Make the pipes plastic. It's a weapon. Who are you going to trust those people with that weapon? A pencil is a weapon I can use to write, draw, teach people to read and write. I can stick that pencil here and I can kill you. So it's great. Systemic thinking, engineering. I like the conflict thing. So yes, there's a lot of overlap with peace engineering, and I think humanitarian engineering is more like Engineers Without Borders, very civil engineering, solving some problems, right, community and all that. But the peace engineering is a little bit wider, and I think encompasses that and other engineerings too. Social engineering, I have issues.
Yeah. Well, you bring up a
get
good
into that one.
you bring up a good point. So one of the projects I led was training mediators in Ukraine during the onset of the war, in the first year of the war, about trauma-informed peace building, how to work with people who've been traumatized. Now, when you ask a Ukrainian, what's your conflict? Russia isn't in the top 10. It's, how do I wash my clothes when there's 10 families living in the same house? How do I have my kids go to school when my kids only speak Russian, they don't speak Ukrainian, and they are discriminated against, and they go last, and the class already has 3 times the number of children in it? That is their conflict. And so engineering, alongside of the psychosocial support, is an answer. It is effective. Yeah, because those are the actual conflicts those people have. What color the flag is that's flying above their house when you have kids and when you have a family is not the least of your concerns, but it's low. Your immediate needs, those needs we talked about, your universal needs, become front and center, and that is something we can work together to resolve.
Well, I don't know if this have an answer, but do you know how could we attract financial investments on peace and engineering and peace in general to conciliate the peace with economic development to attract more qualified mediators and attract more people to this area?
This is one of the most painful parts of our field, is for a fraction of what it costs to wage war, you could have peace. And we know what is produced as a result of it. So the example I use, it's very simple, and it's technology-based, so you'll get this. If you had 12 computers in a room, in a new office, I start a new office, I have 12 computers, and one computer stops talking to the other computers, you would have IT on the phone immediately, fix this computer. If it wasn't done by the end of the day, you'd be furious because you know how much money you're losing. But if 2 people in that office stop talking to each other, you'll let it go on for months or years, as long as they don't break the rules. What are we losing in human capital and human potential by consistently being in these fights? It's not the money we're spending on the arms to kill each other. It's what we're not producing as a society. And as soon as we can measure, maybe with the help of engineering, you can measure that amount. What are we losing by not focusing on human potential? That number is something that an investor could look at and start making smart investments.
Very, very interesting topics. Yeah.
Yeah, Scott, Brian, Mark, oh, Brian's on the, okay. Yeah, we had a Zoom, when you guys went to lunch, we had a Zoom meeting with Bruce Cahan and Camila Gui. They're part of the Peace Engineering Consortium. They presented, and we've been working for 5 to 6 years on finance and looking at the details of finance, bond creation, the color of money, how it moves and all of that. So with Bruce, he created, we always talk about correlation or adjacencies between KPIs. Bruce came up with what he calls it the periodic table quality of life. So this is where we put all together. Bruce is a lawyer and an investment banker. I'm an engineer. There's other people who are lawyers, are from different walks. So when I talked about the intergenerational transfer of money, and tomorrow maybe I can show a slide, it's $84 trillion that needs to exchange hands in the next couple of years. The potential for creating peace technology is there, not war. I don't know if you guys know this, but the Department of Defense in the US, the budget, annual budgets, I'm going to round it up, at $900 billion. We invest more than 10 or 12 countries in the world put together. 54 to 56%, that's 400, close to 500 billion, automatically goes to the industry that produces the weapons. They have a blank check since this was created. And the first person that warned us, the world about this, was Dwight Eisenhower in his famous speech in 1952 or whatever. And this is real. So there's so much power in that industry. They don't even need to lobby. It's done, deal. Now, what about the other that's, let's say 1 trillion. There's $84 trillion that's going to change hands. How can we have those people invest in peace tech, conflict resolution, minimizing risks? If I can minimize your risk in investing in this community for socioeconomic development, and you will get return of your investment, I'll do that instead of investing in weapons. So this is the concept of peace engineering. Use metrics to demonstrate that your money or whatever you do, it will not be wasted, basically. Because conflict is, I mean, we have to resolve that. Once that is broken, you get into war, that's a different problem. So I don't know how we're going to get out of this mess, because it touches everybody. It's like fires in the Amazon or fires in California. It touches the whole world. You can't say the smoke is going to stay in California or the smoke is going to stay in Brazil. It doesn't work that way. Sorry.
Thank you, Ramiro. Any final words of conclusion, Martin? No? Well, I would like to thank you very much. You know, this conference, we're just passing through some of the topics of peace engineering, but what we have been talking about is like next year, what we could do is basically have focused workshops. Brian offers, for instance, a workshop, a 1 day, a 1 week workshop on how do you call that, on peace or mediation. And it would be great to have you here, and we plan for that and focus on that, because I think it will bring a lot of result. Yeah. And thank you, Brian. I hope next time you can be here with us. And thank you. Muito obrigado para todo mundo que está aqui. Vamos agradecer o Jorge também, que ficou além do horário, além do horário dele. And I'll see everyone tomorrow. We begin at 9 a.m. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. Great conference, great discussion.
Thank you, Brian. See you soon.
Okay, take care.
Take care.
Great talk. I really enjoyed that, Scott. Excellent. Thanks.